On this day, June 26th, 2026, three separate, seemingly unrelated crises have reached a boiling point. From the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea to the rugged peaks of southern Lebanon to the executive boardrooms of North American trade negotiators. The fundamental pillars of the post-Cold War security architecture are being dismantled. What the mainstream media is reporting as separate headlines of war, diplomacy, and trade is, in reality, a singular, highly coordinated restructuring of global power. Today, we are seeing the raw limits of military muscle, the severe friction of U.S. economic dominance, and the structural shift from global integration to hard-bordered realpolitik. Let us look past the partisan screaming and the superficial press releases. Today, we will examine the actual mechanics of what is happening. We will trace the logistics of a state of emergency declared just hours ago, read the fine print of a U.S.-sponsored peace treaty that is already fracturing, and analyze the newly leaked negotiating limits of a $2 trillion trade pact. If you are a mature citizen seeking to protect your capital and understand where the world is heading, you must learn to read the board, not just the pieces. This is what we will unpack today. Let us begin with the physical reality of the Eastern European theater. Today, Russian-installed authorities in occupied Crimea took the extraordinary step of declaring a peninsula-wide state of emergency. The immediate trigger was a punishing, multi-region wave of Ukrainian drone strikes. Moscow's own defense ministry reported intercepting a record 660 Ukrainian drones overnight. To put this in perspective, this is the single largest drone bombardment since the war began more than 4 years ago. But what most military commentators miss is that this is not a random act of retaliation. This is the execution of a highly calculated doctrine, the structural blockade of Crimea. Earlier this week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky quietly authorized what he termed a 40-day influence operation against Russian logistics. For months, the Ukrainian General Staff has been methodically executing a logistics lockdown of the peninsula. By systematically destroying roads, bridges, rail lines, and fuel hubs, Ukraine has achieved something that traditional infantry could not. They have isolated Crimea. The data coming out of Crimea today reveals a territory under severe structural stress. Gas stations have completely run dry. Motorists are queuing for hours just to obtain fuel vouchers. Rolling power outages have halted the water pumps and summer camps. Once the Kremlin's pride for showcasing Crimean integration are being abruptly canceled and evacuated. What is the strategic lesson here? It is the power of asymmetry. Ukraine is demonstrating that modern, medium-range drone technology can render a highly fortified, geographically isolated peninsula virtually indefensible without ever launching an amphibious invasion. By choking the water, electricity, and fuel supply, Kyiv is forcing Vladimir Putin to calculate the political cost of holding a territory that has become an economic black hole. Both things can be true at the same time. Russia may still hold the physical ground on the front lines, but Ukraine's targeted logistical asphyxiation is proving that territorial control is meaningless if you cannot power the lights or fuel your transport. Now let us turn to the second major pillar crumbling today, the delicate security landscape of the Middle East. On Friday morning, in Washington, senior representatives from Lebanon and Israel signed a highly anticipated U.S.-sponsored framework deal aimed at bringing a permanent ceasefire to the region. Under normal diplomatic protocols, this should have been a moment of triumph for American foreign policy. Yet, almost before the ink on the document could dry, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a recorded statement that essentially tore up the spirit of the agreement. Netanyahu stated unequivocally that the Israeli military will remain in a designated security zone in southern Lebanon indefinitely, or until Hezbollah is completely disarmed. Simultaneously, his defense minister, Israel Katz, issued a direct warning to Tehran, promising that Israel would strike Iran with full force if there was any retaliation. To understand why this is happening, we must look at the domestic and strategic calculations of the Israeli leadership. Netanyahu is facing immense internal pressure. He is currently attempting to secure unprecedented unilateral control over his Likud party's next candidate slate ahead of upcoming elections. At the exact same time, his years-long criminal trial is concluding, and his credibility is on the line. In this environment, a rapid, total withdrawal from southern Lebanon is a political impossibility for Netanyahu. The framework deal allows the Lebanese army to deploy to the border, but only on the recommendation and approval of the Israeli military. Netanyahu is using this clause to maintain a permanent security presence. He boasted that Israel has moved from merely controlling territory to commanding the strategic high ground, specifically positions near the historic Beaufort Castle. This creates a severe diplomatic crisis for the Trump administration. President Trump has spent weeks pushing for regional peace and declaring that the war with Iran must end. Yet, his chief ally in the region is refusing to step back. This is what 30 years of failed regional architecture looks like. Washington wants a quick, photogenic diplomatic win, while Jerusalem is operating on a timeline of raw physical survival and political preservation. The result is a ceasefire that exists only on paper, while the ground remains highly combustible. Finally, we must look at the silent, high-stakes battle that will affect every single mature citizen reading this script: the looming renegotiation of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. The statutory deadline for the mandatory review is July 1st, 2026, just 5 days away. For months, President Trump has hinted at his willingness to let the historic trade deal expire, using the threat of massive tariffs to force his neighbors into submission. He has argued that Washington does not need a trade deal with its neighbors, sending shockwaves through North American agriculture and manufacturing. But today, the first major crack in the negotiating front has appeared. Mexico's Minister of Economy, Marcelo Ebrard, officially confirmed Mexico's fallback position in a national broadcast. Ebrard stated that if the United States refuses to automatically extend the agreement for another 16 years, Mexico is prepared to accept a 10-year continuation with intensive periodic reviews. This is a massive tactical admission. Mexico is publicly signaling that they will not walk away from the table. They are willing to accept shorter, high uncertainty terms rather than face a complete trade collapse with their largest market. Why is this significant? Because it completely changes the leverage dynamics. Under Article 34.7 of the agreement, if one party refuses to renew, the countries must conduct joint annual reviews. This is exactly what the Trump administration wants: constant, yearly leverage over Canadian and Mexican trade policies. It allows Washington to demand constant concessions on auto manufacturing, environmental laws, and non-trade issues like border security and immigration. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is attempting a vastly different strategy. Rather than playing a defensive game of containment, Carney has launched what his advisors are calling a Make USMCA Great Again strategy. Carney, a veteran of global central banking, understands that Donald Trump scorns the status quo. He knows that the only way to save the 16-year extension is to proactively present Trump with a restructured deal that looks like a major American victory. Carney is quietly aligning Canada with U.S. priorities, most notably by agreeing to isolate Chinese industrial supply lines from North American manufacturing, addressing the controversial anti-China veto in Article 32.10. What does this mean for the global market? The era of secure, long-term, borderless trade is over. Whether it is Mexico accepting a highly unstable 10-year review term, or Canada restructuring its entire industrial policy to appease Washington, the cost of doing business across borders is about to rise. Protracted negotiations mean currency volatility, fluctuating supply chain costs, and structurally higher inflation. If you are managing assets, you must understand that the next few months will not produce a clean, tidy resolution. Businesses must prepare for a prolonged period of strategic friction. As we look at the board on this 26th of June, 2026, the underlying lesson is clear. Military conflicts are no longer solved by sheer force. They are ground down by logistical attrition. Diplomatic treaties are no longer permanent guarantees of peace. They are temporary tools used by politicians facing domestic survival. And international trade is no longer about economic efficiency. It is about geopolitical leverage. The global order is being quietly rewritten. Those who rely on yesterday's assumptions will find themselves unprepared for the structural volatility of tomorrow.